in the subarctic, and how biotic and abiotic factors control population sizes. So some of the ideas and concepts that we're going to look at now, you actually come back to later on in the subject. And you don't need to understand all of the detail at the moment, but this produces quite a nice understanding of how these abiotic and biotic factors interact with each other. So our first thing is to think about abiotic factors again. And our main limiting factor is actually the amount of sunlight that falls. And one of the things is that at high latitudes, so near the poles, the amount of sunlight actually entering the ecosystem is much lower because it's spread out over a much bigger distance. You can see that the diagram represents the idea of this. Yeah? So at the equator, the same amount of sunlight is spread over a smaller difference because of the curvature of the Earth. What this leads to is that the rate of photosynthesis is much lower at the equator. So if the rate of photosynthesis is much lower, there must be much lower energy for the entire ecosystem to utilize. This means that gross primary productivity is much lower at the poles than it is at the equator. Okay. Coupled with that is the fact that the Earth actually tilts. The axis of the Earth is not at 90 degrees, it's actually slightly off at about 23.5 degrees. So what this does, it means it actually creates winter and summer in our hemispheres. So when the axis of the Earth is furthest away from the sun in the north, we have our northern winter. But at the same time, the southern hemisphere has the southern summer. So these are sort of linked together. So during the northern winter, almost no solar energy reaches the very, very high Arctic. This again drastically reduces the productivity at the poles. So we have our first factor that's actually affecting what populations can survive and what size the populations are that can survive and how they're going to interact with each other. What this leads to is extreme seasonality. And there's an interesting thing here is that at the tundra, rainfall is actually very, very low. And if you look at in terms of this graph, that we've got precipitation and we've got temperature. Between January and April, there's actually no precipitation at all. Very little snow actually falls. What happens in those periods is that's actually frozen ground. And during the rest of the year, there's not a great amount of rainfall falls, and quite often a lot of it falls as snow that then melts and is lost from the system. And the temperatures are very, very low. The temperature on this graph is only getting above freezing really from April through until October. So that leaves a very, very small growing season. So we've got limited solar energy with also this excessive, something called an albedo effect. The reason the temperatures are so low at those times is because the snow that's laying on the ground actually reflects back most of the light. So there's very, very little light absorption. What this leads to is very, very short summers, but long hours of daylight. So these long hours of daylight sort of offset it a little bit, but not fully. So the underlying abiotic factors that really limit this environment is actually, one, the amount of precipitation available, but much more importantly is actually the amount of sunlight that falls. That really limits photosynthesis. The result of this is that very, very few plants can actually survive in these extreme conditions. And they all need adaptations to actually survive, because otherwise their cells would freeze. So most of the productivity comes from these things called lichens. Now, lichens aren't actually plants. What they are is an association between a fungus and a photosynthesizing algae. So they photosynthesize when there's enough light available, but at other times the fungus part of the association actually provides the nutrients through decomposition. Of the plants that actually do grow in the growing season, well, all of them are made up of very hard, tough grasses, basically. So this is a cotton grass, and cotton grass is found throughout the tundra environment. It's very, very tough, and the stems are hard, and the leaves are very, very narrow. They're all designed to actually reduce water loss, and they don't freeze So the upshot of this is that productivity in the tundra is very, very low. And if you compare net productivity compared to the tropical rainforest, it's much, much lower. So the tropical rainforest has this much greater productivity because of the amount of sunlight that enters. So with this extreme climate and low productivity, the biomass is actually very, very low. And this low productivity then affects all the rest of the ecosystem. So reindeer are the main herbivores, and throughout the winter they survive on eating nothing other than this lichen, something called reindeer moss. And it's very, very low energy, and it's just a survival food. In the summer, there's more plant choice. So in the summer they actually spend their time trying to put on as much biomass as possible. And so the reindeer will spend all their time in big herds moving from place to place, grazing and putting on as much mass as they possibly can to survive the winter when they've got this really, really very poor diet made up of this reindeer moss. So we can think of this in terms of a systems diagram, that we've got inputs. The inputs are very limited sunlight that produces a very, very poor diet for the reindeer that process it, and the output is for the reindeer actually, one part of it is biomass, and that biomass can then get passed on to the next level. So the wolf population totally depends on the amount of biomass that the reindeer population can actually accumulate in the summer, but the reindeer population totally depends on the amount of biomass that is able to be eaten from the plant material during the summer. And the plant material totally depends on the amount of photosynthesis that can occur mainly during the summer. So each of these levels, each trophic level, each feeding level is an individual system, but together it actually creates an entire chain of systems, a food chain. If you remember in topic 1, we talked about this idea of emergent properties, that these systems give rise to these emergent properties. So each level in this ecosystem, the populations are totally dependent on the amount of energy that is passed along from one of these levels, one trophic level, to the next. So the wolf population can only get its energy from the reindeer, and the reindeer can only get its energy that's been passed on from the plant community. So ultimately the wolf is actually dependent upon the plant community. This means there's always going to be fewer organisms at the top of this food chain than there are at the bottom of it. We'll look at this in more detail in a later video. So let's have a look at this again and think about it, in terms of what we've looked at for the idea of resources and niche. So because of the limits imposed on the ecosystem by the abiotic conditions, the abiotic factors, the populations here occupy very, very unique niches. Lichen exists as a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. It occupies a unique niche. The reindeer spends all of its time in the winter surviving on eating this reindeer moss, but in the summer trying to make the most of the limited photosynthesis that happens, and therefore fits this very unique position. The reindeers are the only big herbivore in the tundra, and the wolf is one of only 1 or 2 major predators. And other than bears, the wolf is the only predator of the reindeer. So you get these unique niches appearing in this ecosystem. So how does that actually affect populations? What does that really mean? What does all this come together and really mean in terms of population? Between the 1940s and the 1960s, a series of studies were undertaken into St. Matthew's Island in Alaska, and they looked at the reindeer population. And as you can see from the graph, the reindeer population was quite low in 1944. And by the mid-1960s, the population was really high and then crashed. What the resource showed was that the amount of winter food available sets the carrying capacity for this ecosystem. There's enough food in the summer for the reindeers to survive, but during the winter, if food becomes limiting, then the population starves. The other thing with this population is there were no wolves on this island, so the population didn't have any predators acting as a control on their numbers. So initially the population grew very, very rapidly and eventually outstripped the ability of the environment to actually provide food. So if we projected this on, if there were wolves actually on the island, it would be the carrying capacity of the herbivore populations that would actually control the size of the predator population. So part of the predator's niche is their ability to actually be able to feed, and that's totally governed by how much food is available for their prey during the winter. And as can be seen from this study, that without predators being in place, the herbivores actually outstrip the amount of food that's available for them. They create a crash famine, yeah? So by about, 1963, there were so many reindeer on the island that they were actually going through a famine because they were out competing each other for the same amount of food. That led to a massive population crash. So let's look at a second study where wolves are involved in this. So this is from Finland, and it's about grey wolf population changes. The top graph shows the wild reindeer population between 1997 and 2008. And the second graph shows the wolf population. So, is there any evidence here of negative feedback of a predator-prey relationship? Well, we've got a limited amount of data, and it's always very, very difficult to rely on a limited amount of data. But if we remember back to the snowshoe hare and lynx, it looks like the system might be setting up a similar sort of pattern. Yeah? And the reality is the actual answer is a lot more complex. But the predator and the prey systems do have an effect on each other. So, what this graph does seem to be showing us is, again, one of these negative feedback loops. Okay, so again, as we saw, that graph actually showed that as the population of the prey grew, there was more food available for the predators. That led to more hunting, which then leads to the prey population falling. That creates less food for the predators, which leads to less hunting, which then again allows the prey population to grow. So that's an example of some of these interactions playing out against themselves. Hopefully that's made that part of the course a little bit clearer. Like I said, some of these things will be looked at in more detail in other videos, but hopefully that's given you an over idea of this relationship between abiotic factors and biotic factors, and how this leads to the development of niches, how niches tend to be realized rather than fundamental niches, and how all of these factors interacting together tend to set carrying capacities through competition in one form or another for organisms in any environment. Okay, thanks a lot.